The door was locked. The curtains were drawn. The table was set. Yet in early 1970s America, something had quietly begun to fracture. No one named it, but everyone felt it. From the outside, these homes still looked right. Lawns were trimmed, mailboxes freshly painted, lights turned on at the same hour every evening. Neighbors waved, children came home from school. Fathers parked their cars in familiar driveways. So why did the air feel so heavy once you stepped inside? Why did no one want to speak out loud? Dinner time arrived. At 6 o'clock sharp, tables were set, plates placed carefully, forks aligned just right. But once everyone sat down, the words never came. There was silence, deep, uncomfortable, lingering. When had this silence first appeared? Children didn't notice at first. For them, silence was part of the house. A world where adults didn't explain things, where questions drifted unanswered, felt normal. Still, somewhere inside they sensed something was wrong. But how do you understand a feeling no one talks about? Inside these homes, something was shifting. The television stayed on longer. News played in the background. Images from Vietnam, economic anxiety, protests, unrest. No one discussed what they saw, yet it all remained in the room. Like an uninvited guest, no one acknowledged. Was this silence really just exhaustion? Fathers came home, coats hung up, shoes left by the door, but they no longer carried stories with them. What happened at work? What was happening in the world? The fears growing quietly inside. All of it stayed unspoken, because talking no longer seemed to fix anything. But where do unspoken things go? Mothers worked to keep the rhythm of the home intact. Meals cooked, laundry folded, children tucked into bed. From the outside, everything looked fine. But late at night, when the house finally slept, there was a woman alone in the kitchen, pausing before turning off the light, thinking, though she wasn't sure about what. Whose loneliness was this really? The American home of the 1970s became a stage. Everyone knew their role. Who sat where? Who spoke when? Who stayed silent? But behind the curtain, something was coming apart. Slowly, quietly, irreversibly. By the time it became visible, would it already be too late? Neighbors didn't notice, or maybe they noticed and chose not to see. Because every house felt the same. Every table shared the same silence. If this were truly a problem, wouldn't someone have said something? Or was it invisible precisely because it was everywhere? No one yelled in this chapter. No doors were slammed. No arguments erupted. And that's what made it dangerous. Because the deepest cracks are always the ones you cannot see. So who would break first? The house still stood. The walls were strong. The door remained locked. But the feeling of safety had already begun to slip away. And the real question was this: who would pay the price for all that silence? The door opened the same way every evening. A key turned. A door creaked open. Familiar footsteps crossed the threshold. But the men who came home were no longer the same. So what had changed? And when did anyone first notice? In 1970s America, fathers were seen as the backbone of the household. Strong, quiet, reliable men who carried weight without complaint. But that silence was no longer strength. It was becoming a burden, because the weight kept growing. Job security was fading. Factories were closing. Promotions stalled. The future felt uncertain, and that uncertainty followed them home. Yet no one spoke about it. Why? Some had returned from war. Others felt the war never really left. Vietnam wasn't only on television. It lived in their eyes. Their sudden anger, their long silences. Children didn't understand this. They only noticed that their fathers laughed less. But how does a child make sense of a change no one explains? At dinner, fathers were present, physically there, but their minds drifted elsewhere. Forks paused mid-air, eyes fixed on nothing. Questions met short answers. I'm fine, just tired. We'll talk later. But later never came. Where did all the unspoken things go? This silence shifted the balance of the home. The father was still the authority, but now unreachable. Children wanted to connect, but hit an invisible wall. Mothers tried to mediate, but the distance kept growing. Could someone be present in a house, yet completely out of reach? Some fathers carried anger. Small things triggered outbursts, noise, mess, questions. The anger came suddenly, then disappeared as if nothing had happened. But it left tension behind. Children learned to read moods. The house developed a quiet radar. How long could that constant alertness last? Others withdrew completely. Newspapers open, television on, eyes avoiding contact. This silence was more unsettling than shouting, because there was no way to ask why. Could a man be this lonely while surrounded by his family? Society didn't name this shift. That's just how men are, people said. They work hard. They're tired. But this wasn't ordinary fatigue. This was identity wearing thin. The exhaustion of being strong, of having no language for fear. And the question lingered. Would this burden be passed down? As children grew, they learned something without being told. Some feelings stay hidden. Some questions go unasked. Some fears are carried quietly. No one said it out loud, but it was taught every day. And when these children grew up, would they know how to do anything differently? As the chapter closed, the house still stood. The father still sat at the table, but the bond had quietly thinned. And now the question felt unavoidable. When this silence finally broke, what would remain? The house kept functioning, but no longer in balance. Now it was running on endurance. And more, that endurance rested on mother's shoulders. When did this weight become so invisible? In 1970s America, mothers began managing more than households. They managed emotional gaps where fathers fell silent. Mothers filled the space. They answered children's questions, softened tensions, kept the atmosphere normal. But the cost of that normality was paid quietly. Who was noticing? Morning started early. Coffee brewed. Children got ready. Doors opened and closed. The day filled with tasks that never truly ended. But the deepest exhaustion didn't come from chores. It came from what remained unsaid. Because mothers weren't just carrying their own emotions. They were carrying everyone else's. How many people can one person hold together? When fathers came home at night, mothers assessed the room. Was tonight quiet or tense? Should the children be more careful? Which topics should stay off the table? The home became an invisible control room, and maintaining that control led slowly to burnout. Was anyone sharing this weight? Society labeled these women strong. She handles everything. She keeps it together for the kids. She always manages. But these compliments masked isolation, because strength meant not asking for help. And when no help was asked for, none arrived. Was this silence really a choice? Night revealed the house's true shape. When everyone slept, one light stayed on in the kitchen. A woman sat at the table, hands paused for a moment. Dishes could wait, thoughts could not. Did I do something wrong? Hung unanswered in the air. Who did this question belong to? Motherhood had become more than care. It was emotional engineering, protecting children, buffering fathers, preventing collapse. But who was protecting the mother? Postponing one's own needs slowly made them disappear. How long can someone postpone themselves? Some mothers entered the workforce. It looked like independence, but it also doubled the load. Be strong at work. Be strong at home. Be strong everywhere. Strength was everywhere. Rest was nowhere. Was this progress or simply a new form of solitude? Children sensed their mother's strength, but they also sensed distance. Approaching someone who seems strong is difficult. Children noticed sadness, but hesitated to name it. She already has enough to carry. Empathy was learned early, but was it also early surrender? There was no dramatic rupture in this chapter. No one left. No voices were raised. And that's why the unraveling ran deep. Motherhood grew heavier. Loneliness took root quietly. And because it went unnoticed, it grew stronger. How do you heal something no one sees? The house still worked. The gears kept turning. But the person at the center of it all was increasingly alone. And now the question became unavoidable. How much longer could this weight be carried? Children hear everything, but they don't understand everything. And inside 1970s American homes, the space between those two things kept growing. How does a child carry a truth that is never named? The house was quiet, but silence didn't mean peace. The quieter it was, the more alert children learned to be. Footsteps, the way a door closed, the volume of the television, everything was a signal. The house spoke a language without words, and children learned it instinctively. When did that learning begin? No one sat them down and said, "Something is changing." No one said, "This isn't your fault," because adults didn't fully understand it themselves. Or they did, but had no words. So children filled in the gaps on their own. And the gaps children fill are often filled with guilt. Why is that? When a father grew silent, the child questioned themselves. When a mother grew tired, the child learned to ask for less. When the house felt tense, the child tried to disappear. This wasn't a conscious choice. It was survival. But why did survival begin at home? School was different. Teachers explained rules. Friends laughed. But returning home meant entering another world. A world where questions were unwelcome, where feelings were postponed or suppressed. Children moved between two realities. Which one was real? Some withdrew, retreating to their rooms, spending hours alone. Others became overly compliant. The easy child, the good kid. It sounded like praise, but no one noticed it was armor. Was quiet obedience really health? The children of the 1970s grew up. Early, emotionally, they carried responsibilities beyond their years, protected siblings, read their mother's expressions, adjusted themselves to their father's moods. Did this make them strong or simply alone? No one talked about child psychology then. Trauma wasn't a household word. Feelings were something to discipline, suppress, or wait out. But some things didn't fade. They just changed shape. Who would notice? Some children expressed anger, but it often appeared in the wrong places. At school, against authority. They were labeled problems, but they were trying to communicate something. Was anyone listening? Others became invisible, quiet, well-behaved, model children. No one looked deeper because nothing seemed wrong. But does silence really mean safety? These children learned lessons without being taught. Feelings can be burdens. Questions can disturb. Silence can protect. No one said it out loud, but it was reinforced daily, until it became part of who they were. And when these children became adults, would they carry that silence with them? As the chapter unfolded, one truth became clear. Being a child in a 1970s American home wasn't just about growing up. It was about carrying what others couldn't say, what others couldn't face, what others kept quiet. The house looked the same. The rooms were unchanged. Toys still lay on the floor, but the children were no longer the same. And now the question cut deeper than before. What kind of adults would grow out of this silence? The living room light was on. The television was playing. Yet the house had never felt so quiet. How can there be sound and still no conversation? In 1970s America, television was no longer just an object. It sat at the center of the home. Furniture faced it. Evenings revolved around it. News, shows, commercials, everything flowed from that screen. But the real change wasn't what television added. It was what it replaced. What had disappeared? Evenings once held conversation. How was your day? What happened? What comes next? These questions faded. The answers felt too complicated, too heavy, and television offered escape. Watching was easier than talking. But does what we avoid truly vanish? The news was bad, nearly every night. War footage, economic anxiety, political scandals. Watergate whispered into living rooms. Trust eroded. Families watched quietly, without reaction, because they didn't know how to feel. How did that uncertainty seep into the home? Father sat on the couch, eyes on the screen, mind somewhere else. Television became a shield against thought. Mother sat nearby, but distance lingered. Children sat on the floor watching cartoons, while absorbing fragments of the news behind them. They didn't understand, but they felt it. How does a child process signals meant for adults? Television made families appear together. Same room, same images, but it wasn't connection. It was parallel solitude. Everyone present, no one reachable. Does sharing a screen equal sharing a life? Commercials sold hope. Better lives, happier families, big homes, smiling faces. As the gap between screen and reality widened, silence deepened. Comparison crept in. The question, what are we doing wrong, went unspoken, but it lingered. Where did that feeling go? For children, television taught lessons. What families should look like, what happiness resembled, but their own homes didn't match. The contradiction created quiet confusion. Which was real? Which was expected? Over time, television replaced conversation. Questions stayed unasked. Conflicts postponed. Emotions suppressed. Because with a screen on, no one had to face each other. But emotions avoided don't disappear. They accumulate. When would that accumulation spill over? No one turned off the TV in this chapter. No one said, "Oh, we need to talk." The sentence felt too heavy, and everyone, in their own way, avoided that weight. But avoidance isn't resolution. It only delays. What would the cost of that delay be? The night ended. The program stopped. The screen went dark, but the silence remained. Because once conversation is lost, restarting it isn't easy. The living room stayed the same, the furniture unchanged, the television still in the corner. But the bond inside the house loosened once more. And now the question sharpened. Was television the cause of the silence? Or merely the thing that filled the space it left behind? No one woke up one morning and said, "Today we're ending this." Divorce wasn't sudden. It arrived slowly, quietly, and often without explanation. How does a marriage end without anyone noticing? In 1970s America, separation became more common, but rarely discussed. Small mentions in newspapers, whispers in neighborhoods. They moved there, taking some time apart. The kids are with their mother. Sentences stayed short because the reasons were long and complicated, and no one wanted to step into that complexity. Why all the silence? Many marriages still looked intact from the outside. Same house, same address, same last name. But inside, something had broken. Conversations had stopped. Touch had faded. The need to plan together was gone. The separation wasn't legal, but emotionally, it had already happened. Was this still being together? Divorce was often not an explosion, but a withdrawal. Couples avoided arguments, avoided confrontation, avoided saying too much. Silence became a strategy. But silence isn't repair, it's delay. How long can a crack stay hidden? For women, separation carried a different weight. Society still expected them to hold the family together. Leavings was seen as failure. So many stayed, quietly carrying unhappiness, because staying invited less judgment than leaving. Was that a choice or a constraint? For men, separation often felt like defeat. Strength didn't align with failure, so emotions went unnamed. Reasons stayed vague. The marriage ended, but the story was never told. Can an untold story ever truly end? For children, the process was even more confusing. No one explained clearly. Your parents aren't together anymore. Often came late. Before that, there were only changes. A father appearing less, a mother growing more tired, a home splitting in two. But the fracture had no name. How do you grieve something unnamed? Some homes never separated, but that didn't mean they were happy. Staying together became habit. Same bed, different worlds. Same table, broken connections. Children in these homes learned a frozen version of love. How would that shape the love they sought later? Society normalized the rise. Times are changing, people said. People don't have to endure anymore. That was true, but no one talked about the emotional cost. Separation might bring freedom, but it also left uncertainty behind. Where did that uncertainty go? As divorces increased, the idea of home shifted. Home no longer meant permanence. Togetherness came without guarantees. This affected children as much as adults. Trust eroded slowly. How long can a bond survive without trust? There were no dramatic courtroom scenes in this chapter. No shouting matches. No public accusations. And that's why the impact ran deep. Because quiet endings linger longer. How many lives did these silent endings redirect? Homes split. Belongings were divided. Lives were rearranged. But unanswered questions remained. And now the question weighed heavier than ever. Was separation truly an ending? Or the beginning of something everyone would carry forward? No one told them, "You're grown now." But at some point, they stopped acting like children. Questions faded. Wants became smaller. And inside the home, a careful awareness appeared. When does a child become quiet? In 1970s America, childhood meant living between two worlds. Television showed happy families. Schools spoke of bright futures. But the feeling inside the home didn't match those stories. Children couldn't articulate it, but they noticed. You didn't need to be an adult to sense something was wrong. How did that awareness settle inside a child's mind? There were unspoken topics at home. The distance between parents, money worries, uncertain futures. Children weren't included in these conversations. But exclusion wasn't protection. It only deepened uncertainty. Is fearing the unknown heavier than fearing what you understand? Some children became good kids. They stayed quiet, delayed their needs, played silently in their rooms. The house already felt tense. They didn't want to add to it. Was this kindness or a responsibility taken on without consent? At school, teachers saw something else. Quiet, cooperative, well-behaved children. But this silence didn't come from peace. It came from caution. Don't say the wrong thing. Don't ask the wrong question. Don't disturb the fragile balance at home. Was that ever a child's role? Others reacted differently. They grew angry, pushed boundaries, because anger raised in silence must escape somewhere. These children were labeled troubled. But was the problem in their behavior or in the place that shaped it? Parents often didn't notice. Their own burdens were heavy. Finances, relationships, social pressure. There was little energy left to look inward, into a child's emotional world. But unseen emotions don't disappear. They transform. What would they become? Children of the 1970s learned early how to suppress feelings. Crying meant weakness. Fear felt shameful. Questions were unnecessary. These lessons weren't spoken, but lived. How would this learned silence speak in adulthood? Many children tried to fill the emotional gaps of their parents. Comforting mothers, calming fathers, caring for siblings. Roles shifted quietly. Childhood slipped away. Who paid the price for that shift? Psychology wasn't a common language then. Trauma wasn't widely discussed. Children forget easily, people said. But forgetting isn't healing. What's buried returns eventually. How would it return? There were no dramatic scenes in this chapter, but there were small moments, whispers through half-open doors, late-night silences, tension on familiar faces. These moments embedded themselves in memory, and years later, they lingered as unease, without a clear source. Now the question runs deeper. When these children grow up, will they inherit the silence, or find the strength to break it? At some point, silence stopped working. Everything held inside demanded release, and youth became the perfect moment for that release. When suppressed emotions finally find a voice, what do they become? As the late 1970s approached, being young in America carried a different weight. The silence learned at home searched for expression outside. Emotions that couldn't be spoken had to find somewhere to live. The search wasn't random. It was the result of accumulation. Where would that accumulation flow? Music grew louder, harsher, lyrics angrier. Rock, punk, protest music, these weren't just entertainment. They were language, translations of what couldn't be said. With headphones on, the world made more sense. Was this really music? Or a contained scream? Streets changed. Teenagers stayed out later. Home became an address rather than a refuge. Safe but distant. protective yet suffocating. Leaving home didn't mean abandoning it. It meant breathing. How long could that escape last? Some built identity through appearance. Hair grew or was cut sharp. Clothes became statements. The body turned into a messenger. See me? It said. But did being seen mean being understood? Schools saw more conflict. Rules were questioned. Authority challenged. These youths were labeled problems. But was the issue rule-breaking? Or what the rules represented? Others withdrew, stayed in their rooms, wrote in journals. Pages hid sentences never spoken aloud. Fears, hopes, anger. This inner world stayed invisible, but it intensified. Would it one day explode? Youth became a testing ground. Boundaries pushed, risks taken. Alcohol, substances, dangerous behavior, often not for pleasure but to feel. Long suppressed emotions had dulled sensation. Feeling anything felt better than feeling nothing. What was the cost of that search? Distance from parents widened. Conversations grew sharp, or disappeared entirely. They lived in the same house like strangers. Both sides wanted understanding, but a shared language was gone. Could that rupture be repaired? Society struggled to understand this generation. They were called rebellious, disrespectful, ungrateful. But labels failed to explain. This generation had grown in a void, raised in silence, and now it was rejecting that silence. How long could that resistance last? This chapter was loud. Music, slamming doors, sharp laughter. But the noise didn't signal peace. It echoed in a disorder. And now the question cuts deeper. Would these voices finally be heard? Or would they be silenced again? Passed to another generation? Something had changed. The problem was no longer confined to living rooms. Silence had spilled into the streets, and the streets began speaking in their own language. What does a society do with emotions it suppresses? By the late 1970s, America's streets felt different. Youth voices were louder. Protests, marches, counterculture movements became more visible. But this wasn't just political agitation. It was the release of long-suppressed emotion. Was that emotion only about injustice? Neighborhoods were shifting. People knew each other less. Doors stayed closed. Community ties weakened. The fractures inside homes echoed outside. Living near one another no longer meant feeling connected. What happened to trust? Youth anger became visible. Graffiti covered walls. Music clubs filled. Nights stretched longer. These spaces became stages for the unspoken. But expression doesn't always equal understanding. What does misunderstood anger become? Clashes with police increased. The distance between youth and authority widened. Control answered resistance. But control didn't bring understanding. It sharpened lines instead. How did these encounters reshape both sides? Media labeled it a crisis, a youth crisis, a moral crisis, social decay. But labels stayed on the surface. Few wanted to examine the roots, because those roots led back into homes. Why was that confrontation avoided? Some adults were afraid. Streets felt unfamiliar. Music was loud, clothing strange. But was this just generational difference, or something deeper? Economic uncertainty worsened the picture. Fear of unemployment, inflation, anxiety about the future. These pressures strained an already fragile social fabric. Can a society carry emotional and economic weight at the same time? Some youth lost their way. Crime increased. Substance abuse grew. This was framed as moral failure. But perhaps it was directionlessness. How does anger without direction express itself? The streets were speaking, but who was listening? There was sound but no response. Many voices shouted. Few understood. In this chapter, the social structure cracked. Small fractures merged, and the noise became impossible to ignore. Now the question expanded. Would this noise spark real change, or simply lay the ground for another silence? The story didn't end here, because some eras don't disappear. They transform. The 1970s passed, but did they truly leave? As America moved beyond the 1970s, it believed a new chapter had begun. The economy would recover. Trust would be rebuilt. Families would find balance, but many questions remained unanswered. And unanswered questions travel forward. Where did they go? The children raised in silence were now adults, building homes of their own, raising children of their own. And without realizing it, they spoke the language they knew: avoidance, suppression, delay. They had learned survival through silence, not dialogue. When does a learned reflex fade? Televisions grew larger, technology advanced, but function stayed the same. Screens continued to fill emotional gaps, a modern way to avoid facing one another. Had the tools changed? Or the habits? Divorce became more open, more accepted, but emotional disconnection remained. People learned how to leave, but not always how to bond. Was separation a solution, or part of another cycle? The youth of the 1970s became parents in the 80s and 90s. They vowed not to repeat what they lived through. But trauma doesn't listen to intentions. What isn't spoken transfers through behavior. Is saying "I won't be like that" ever enough? Some recognized the cycle, sought therapy, learned to speak, named emotions. That was a rupture, but it was individual. On a societal level, silence still held power. Can a society heal through individual breakthroughs alone? The legacy of the 1970s wasn't a single event. It was a collection of feelings: distrust, alienation, distance. These weren't openly discussed, but they were passed down. Does this inheritance ever end? Today the decade is called a transitional period, but the destination of that transition remains unclear, because some transitions never complete. They remain suspended, and suspended weight is still weight. Are we still carrying it? This documentary doesn't search for blame. It doesn't judge a generation. It doesn't romanticize a decade. It states one thing: what isn't spoken will speak eventually. There was silence in the 1970s, noise in the 1980s, confusion after that. And now the moment to look back has arrived. The final question can no longer be avoided. Will we continue carrying this legacy, or will we finally choose to speak?